Hello, thank you for coming for the third Atlas lecture for 2025 already. And I will give a very short introduction to our speaker today, Dr. Krapf. He's the scientific secretary of the Swiss School of Archaeology in Greece since 2015. Since 2015, also, he co-directs the school's fieldwork at Amarinthos. And since 2021, he co-directs with Dr. Stella Chrysoulaki the Greek-Swiss excavation and survey project on and around the Hellanion Oros on Aegina. Dr. Krapf received his PhD from the University of Basel and Paris about the Middle Minoan to Early Iron Age pottery from, and I hope I will pronounce this correctly, Sovyan, okay, in Albania. Southeastern Albania, and he holds a master's from the University of Basel in classical archaeology and Egyptology. Tobias is involved in a series of projects in Albania, North Macedonia, and Kosovo, as well as research in Greece on Middle Helladic pottery from sites in Evia, Phiotida, and Thessaly. He participates in the surveys in the Korce Plain in Albania and the Mazi archaeological project. And this year, he will be teaching a course on Mycenaean archaeology at Lausanne University. And in June, July, the summer school session for the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. So, Tobias, please. Thank you.
Okay, so many thanks, Tina, for this kind introduction and for everyone to come. It's a great pleasure to present our research on Aegina in the frame of this seminar here at the Belgium and Netherlands Institute, a project on that involves both excavation and survey on the Hellanion Oros in Southern Aegina. Of course, a project that is made up by an entire team, and you see all the group photos from the last 4 years of this 5-year project, both on survey and on excavation. And I want especially to thank everyone who's involved in this project, and and the co-director of the project, Stella Chrysoulaki, but of course as well Leonidas Vokotopoulos and Sofia Michalopoulou, who is also the responsible archaeologist for Aegina, and they're all involved in the project, as well as Jérôme André, who is doing the topographic work and the drone documentation, and François de Polignac, who is also involved in the site, and you will see why. As well as a whole team of students from diverse universities from several countries, both in Europe and in the States, that made all this work actually possible, as well as restorers, specialists for the different materials, and our workers from Aegina, and some that came with us from Eritrea to Aegina. It's a site that actually everyone should know and should see. Here it's a view from Lykavitos, the Acropolis in the front, or the closer up, actually in plain view of Athens, or of course from Sunion, as many other sites and locations. It's a site that you see when you navigate into the Saroni Gulf here around the Cap Sunion again and towards Piraeus. So a site that probably also served as an orientation mark for seafaring. A site that you see also, of course, from the other side of the Saroni Gulf here, from the Calauria Sanctuary on Poros. Or from one of the few sites or locations actually where you can see Nafplio and Athens in one view from the Arachne on the mountain on Peloponnese. Here, admittedly, you need good eyes or a good camera lens to see the Hellanion Oros here on Aegina behind Angistri Island. And of course, you see it from many locations, and this is not by chance, of course, on Aegina itself, here from the Sanctuary of Aphaia, or behind the harbor and behind the Colonna settlement, or here from the settlement of Colonna and the Temple of Apollo at Colonna, or here again from the harbor. And actually, you still, I mean, you can see actually from when entering Aegina, you can see the small chapel that is today where once the Sanctuary of Zeus stood. It's really a site in the very center of the Saroni Gulf. It's the highest point at about 530 meters above sea level, so with a very, very high visibility and really marking the entire landscape. a site that, of course, that has been mentioned in many ancient sources, and I don't want to go into detail tonight, but it's a site that is mentioned especially also by Pausanias, who writes about Aiakos, Zeus' son, that sacrificed to his father on the top of the mountain for a period, asking for rain in a period of drought. And other writers also connect the site with weather phenomena. Actually, here from Theophrast, so if you see clouds around Hellanion Oros, you will get rain, which is not that surprising after all. It's a site that has not been visited first by us. Of course, there is a sign, Temple of Zeus Hellanios. You see actually the lower part of the sanctuary on the slope, which has been excavated by the German Archaeological Institute at the very beginning of the 20th century by the archaeologists Furtwängler and others that were working at AFEA at that time, and then re-excavate also just before the 2000s by Hans Ulrich Goethe, who did another trenches and redraw also the plan of the site. A major construction with two building phases from the Archaic and the Hellenistic periods, overbuilt then by a Byzantine monastery that today dominates the site, and that of course has many blocks from the sanctuary used in its walls. Or here from an older view, so you see this kind of P-shaped stoa with a small monastery that was built later on top. A site that's certainly not by chance, close to two kind of cisterns, or as they call in Aegina, suvales, so natural openings that contain water and that have been improved with walls already from the Archaic period, that has been documented, especially by Goethe, but also previously when they were dry at some point. And that was also the moment when, in 1905, this bronze hydra has been found, which has an inscription, a dedication to Zeus Hellanios, and that actually made the identification of the sanctuary. Now, this was not always obvious, because if you go further back into the 19th century, here from the Expedition de Morée, you see there are two sites mentioned. One is Mont Saint-Élie, which is the Prophetess Elias, so the mountain top. Today it's a church of Analepsy, of the Ascension, but often it's also called in literature Prophetess Elias, as so many mountaintop churches. And there is another entry about the Temple of Jupiter, Pan-Hellenic, which was then still meant for the Temple of Aphaia, which was kind of the obvious identification. There is one major temple standing, and this has been identified still then in the first half of the 19th century as the Temple of Zeus. So ways before, inscriptions have been found at both sides, both at Aphaia and in the sanctuary of Zeus on the slope of Mount Hellanion. As you can see, yeah, as actually he mentions that the Mustoxid is the first to dig on the slope or on the mountain top, and one of the first to think that this is actually the sanctuary of Zeus. But we had to wait for the discovery of those inscriptions. The site has been reinvestigated later again, but unfortunately, the only documentation left today is this sketch by Welter from the 1930s that shows, however, that around the church there's a whole field of ruins with these small buildings, but also circular walls that enclose the site. And of course, one figurine, they only find it is on display in the Aegina Museum today, and then somehow, of course, points to a use as a sanctuary in the Mycenaean period on the mountaintop. But I don't want to go further into research history. You can read this in a 2025 article that's just been published in the acts of a conference that took place last year at Strasbourg, that you can also find online on the Institute's website. So when you now look from the site, here in the circle is the Temple of Aphaia. You really see this big field of ruins around the mountaintop, with part of the circular walls, but also a more massive wall here, and then all these houses that have been completely collapsed. So we did excavate those the last 4 years, but that's not the subject of tonight's talk. Still, I should mention some of the main results that will put everything into a framework. So we're focusing mainly around the church itself, obviously looking for the peak sanctuary, the sanctuary of Zeus, and the Mycenaean potential peak sanctuary would be to dig on the very top. But there is, unfortunately, this church. So a few trenches have been opened just around the church, and certainly one of the main results, and this is one of the open questions that has been left after the early excavations, is that we definitely have a Middle Bronze Age occupation, which is important because it's one of the main phases, of course, of Colonna on Aegina. So it's very significant to have finds and proper layers on top of the mountain. Also, of course, in a phase when Aegina had proven contacts with Crete and influences from Crete, and that would make perfectly sense, of course, for then to have such a peak sanctuary also here on Aegina. We did other trenches as well in some of those houses around the peak. Many of these are actually quite late, medieval, or even later. But still, in all the area, of course, we find traces of the cult from the historic periods of the site. In fact, when digging on the northern, so here on the photo is the lower side, just below the church, we found a very thick layer with all the burnt remains from the animal sacrifice that took place on top of the mountain. So the last years we were basically digging here, and you see why, because we found some undisturbed late Mycenaean remains. There is at least one structure, but this year we opened another trench and there's one more space close to it with all the inventory of more than 30 vases of very early late Helladic 3C period that are still preserved on site. So just a few impressions from the excavation of the last 3 years in this room. So with many of these very typical late Helladic 3 Aeginitan tripod cooking pots, but also storage vessels. And here a few of those that have already been restored. Definitely, if you see the carinated tripod, definitely indicating a date that goes into late Helladic 3C. And it's of course significant to get such an assemblage on Aegina, where you don't have that many other assemblages from that period of the very end of the Mycenaean period. Other houses here, so these square buildings that are also already shown on the plans from the 1930s, they could belong to the same period, but we did clean the area this year and also earlier, but we have not yet excavated in that area to prove that further. But it also looks like much of this has been cleaned in the early 20th century, so it will be hard to excavate that. But they're actually here built just on top. A Cyclopean wall, a small Cyclopean wall that also could be kind of a fortification of a refuge type settlement from the very end of the Mycenaean period here on top of the mountain. Later in the historic phases, we definitely have the sanctuary of Zeus, but we cannot really excavate it because the church is on top, and really you actually can see there is a foundation here that runs under the church, and the church itself is built with spolia from ancient buildings. Furthermore, earlier, but we never found this fragment again, there are some architectural members, and we have also a large fragment of Corinthian tiles that clearly show that there was a small building, probably an altar as well, on top of the mountain. So this makes actually a very interesting story, to break it short. So we have first occupation that is hard to grasp actually by excavation, but we have the figurine, we have Middle Bronze Age remains that we think we have actually a peak sanctuary or a mountaintop sanctuary during the phase when Aegina Colonna was flourishing. Then we have a refuge settlement potentially fortified in the late Helladic 3C period. And then we get the sanctuary of Zeus that starts latest in the geometric period, and that goes in difference to the sanctuary of Aphaia well into the Roman period. In difference to Aphaia, of course, this was a Pan-Hellenic sanctuary that had significance way beyond Aegina, and thus it's visible from way beyond Aegina, as you just saw, while Aphaia was more or less neglected after the catastrophe of Aegina in the 5th century. And then we get later again a settlement on the mountaintop in the medieval period, so it shifts again. And if you want to add even the modern or the early modern period, it is again a ritual place with the church of Analepsy or Ascension on the top of the mountain. So it is a site that really actually tells the story of Aegina Island as a whole, all this shifting story between really flourishing periods, as is the Middle Bronze Age with Colonna, and that is, of course, the Archaic period when Aegina was a major power in central Greece and in the Saronic Gulf. But it also shows the periods where Aegina was, when the darker periods of Aeginetans history. Might this be the late Vedic 3C period? Might this be the medieval period? And of course, it's not a unique place where settlement was shifting away in the medieval period from the coast, but that's actually everywhere the case in coastal areas of Greece. And it's also not unique for Aegina, of course, with the main capital going inlands in late antiquity and staying at Paleochora, which still can be visited. But again, also, of course, today it's at the harbor, and last but not least, it was also for a short period the capital of modern Greece with a new flourishing period. And that's the time now when Oros also is again a ritual place. Now, in order to understand this, and we really think that this site kind of tells the story of Aegina, it's a site that has not been much explored, or at least not published what has been done earlier. But we really believe that this is a site that is significant for understanding Aeginetan history, but also beyond. And that's why we want to explore the mountain peak, not just by itself, but within a landscape approach. And this in two different scales. One is the landscape immediately around. This is interesting, of course, for the phases when it was a settlement or a refuge settlement on the top, because people had to live from something. And this is not obvious on this mountain top with no water supply, and in a landscape also that today is completely abandoned. And that is being done by intensive and extensive survey of the landscape around the mountaintop in a admittedly not very easy landscape. And for that we got in the permit of the project, we got about an eighth of the island for survey, which is this area, this uninhabited area, except the small village of Lachides that is around the mountain itself. But of course, for the periods when it's a sanctuary, a pan-Hellenic sanctuary, if you want, you have to look beyond Aegina as well, and there you need a different approach. And that's where François de Polignac was very interested in the project and is following this, also the project on site, exploring intervisibility and the relation between different sanctuaries of Zeus. After all, what we see on Aegina is something we see actually at many other regions and places around the Saronic Gulf. And all these different sanctuaries on mountaintops around the Saronic Gulf, some of course on much higher locations like on Hymettos and on the Parnitha mountain, they're all interconnected and they're visible from each other. Just to make the turn, this year we had extremely good visibility from Aegina, so we could document this visibility. So you have Hymettos, of course, and Parnitha perfectly visible from Aegina, but actually even Mount Ochi with the Dracospita on its top, that you can see the mountain from here or in a closer view on good days. Although, of course, the identification as a sanctuary of Zeus can also be debated for the Dracospita, but that's another project that the Swiss school also was involved. Or towards Peloponnese, of course, Mount Arachnaim, we already saw the opposite view that you can discern from here. Now, of course, you have to know which peak it is, but I guess if you're doing sacrifice, if there is fire involved, visibility might actually be given. Yeah, and here again, so the backwards view, so you can actually see from Arachnaim, you see Hymettos as well, you see the Hellanion Oros on Aegina. And Arachnaim, of course, is a site that has been identified by its find as a sanctuary already from Mycenaean times here. Unfortunately, with a church that was built in last generation on top of the ancient and prehistoric remains, and now with all the wind generators also on the mountain. And just about the visibility, this year it was really incredible. So if you look out from Aegina, you can actually see all this part of the Cyclades down to Milos on good days. Now, probably on the photo it's hard to see, but believe us, when we were this year on Aegina, you could really discern actually all this major part of the Aegean. And it is a site, as tell the ancient sources, that is related to weather phenomena. We can document this ourselves from the excavation, as you also can see from this photo here. And these are certainly days you don't want actually to be excavating on the top when Zeus is approaching. And it's interesting that we have, in a recent study, this is actually being shown that there might be a relation between weather phenomena, natural phenomena, here done by the team from Mount Lycaon of the American School, where they show both seismic or earthquake impacts for the choice of location, but also actually the visibility and the frequency of thunderstorms and lightnings at this specific place. Now they counted this, both the, frequency, but also on how many days. This is the second last column in the year. You actually can see lightnings and thunderstorms from the site. And in Mount Lycaon, this might work. There's really a very high and higher than usual frequency, but for the Hellanion Oros, unfortunately, we have one of the lowest values of the Zeus sanctuaries. But it's also, of course, a very different location to Western Greece, actually, where there is much more storms and severe weather still today. Anyways, now coming to the site itself and the survey we're doing around the site, because about the studies by de Polignac too, you can read in an article in the same volume from the Strasbourg conference, so I don't want to say more about that. But when coming out to the survey area, I certainly should mention two more sites when we talk about Mycenaean period, or the end of the Mycenaean period. The one is Megali Koriffi, which is being explored by Leonidas Vokotopoulos and Sofia Michalopoulou. Also through excavation, it's great that both are actually here. So if there are questions about that site, of course, they might also answer. Which, I mean, it's certainly significant to have another Mycenaean site of Lazarides, about 2 kilometers as the crow flies from the Hellanion Oros. That, of course, plays also a very important part in understanding the landscape of Aegina in the Mycenaean period. Also because we cannot really grasp it at Aegina Colonna. Yeah, just an impression for those who have never visited the Megali Koriffi, a really impressive fortification that's still preserved. But today, the landscape, as I mentioned, is almost entirely abandoned about Hellanion Oros, of course, for many reasons, as this might also for agriculture not be worth anymore to be exploited. But as you can see, it is a landscape that until very recently has been intensively used. Terraces have been built to the most impossible places, high up slopes. And doing especially extensive survey, we find at any impossible and remote places, we find traces of small huts, small hamlets, enclosures, animal pens, and other structures. Sometimes in the larger compounds, sometimes simple huts that are alone somewhere in the landscape. And the most important thing, of course, is access to water. And this is something which is one of the focuses, of course, of our project. We really like to describe and to study also the early modern use of landscape, because that might also actually tell us how one can survive in this region. So we have some of these suvales actually at all the major strategic spots where we have also small nuclei of habitation. Here's one of the bigger ones, always with a visibility towards the peak of Hellanion Oros, and they're still being used actually. And, I mean, they still have water almost the entire year, and they're still being used with some of these basins that might date much earlier, of course, still being used by the shepherds of the area. Here at one of the locations, as you can see, as an example, one of those structures or complexes that were being exploited until quite recently at the so-called the Dracospito, which is an enigma by itself, of course, a site that we have intensively documented, also without excavation, but with material collection and with photogrammetry and topography. A site that might date much earlier, and something that interests us a lot, as we have another team at the Swiss school that's working on several Dracospita houses built with these massive stones in southern Euboea, and that for at least two of them we really could prove that they're ancient, I mean from antiquity, not prehistoric, but definitely ancient structures. But the problem of those is, of course, that they have been used until almost today by shepherds, so it's very hard to actually date them by material evidence. In any case, if you see there is, so it's everything you need around the structure that was still being exploited. You have a threshing floor, you have a small cistern for water, and you have all these terraced areas for agriculture that was used until very recently. And this is really an example of what you can find all over the landscape, with dozens or hundreds of such structures, small huts as mentioned, threshing floors, small rock shelters that have been walled off, and so on. So we're documenting this in extensive survey, but of course also when we encounter that during intensive survey, all these different features, these are just the ones that we actually documented on site and that we visited during survey, but there are many more that you can actually see through remote sensing in this area. We're documenting them directly in an online GIS system on tablets, so you can actually describe them on the site, and everything goes directly into a database of ArcGIS. You also have the photos of the different structures directly integrated into a web GIS system. And again, as already said, one of the main interests certainly are the different structures that are related to water use. We have more than 20 of these different suvalles of different sizes, of course, that you can encounter at many locations, always connected with these different basins. Actually, you take the water out, and from there the animal would then drink. But there are also some smaller openings in rocks that contain water even in late summer, or even some built wells, of course, near to structures. And you can see them here mapped with these blue dots all around the Oros itself. Only on the top there is no such structure, at least that we could document today. Now, intensive survey is definitely not something new for us at the Swiss School. We did survey at the Villa area with the Masi archaeological projects in the, until 2017. And we're doing since 21 now a survey between Eretria and the Marinthos intensively on a much larger scale than what we're doing on Aegina, but it's also a very different landscape, of course, and a very different setting. Here interested in the connection between Eretria and the main extra-urban sanctuary. But we're trying to use the same methodologies also to make different surveys in Greece comparable, and I think when you just count all the different surveys of people that were involved in the Masi project and they're doing now their own surveys around Greece and using similar or at least comparable methodologies, I think we really have a chance to compare and to get a wider picture for survey archaeology now in the 21st century. So documentation is done directly in 123 survey, either on iPad, or you can actually use it on a mobile phone as well, where you can document. You need ideally mobile internet access, so you can get the back maps also, and you can locate it directly with your position on the GPS on your phone or on your device. You can actually locate the different areas that you survey, and you can do the entire documentation directly on site. Sometimes this is problematic in such remote areas as in Aegina, where you don't have very good connections, so it's a bit harder to work. You have to work offline. But all the data is immediately integrated directly into the server. We can upload this immediately, even from the field, and you can work actually on the base maps then on a computer and also from remote. We did mainly tracked surfaces according to the terraced areas, but also outside the terraced surfaces. But we did also test-wise some gridded collection in squares on a few sites. And we will certainly do this on other sites we identified, and we'll come back to now in the next part of the talk in order to have a more clear picture. So again, as for the features, everything can be documented directly in the system with the different entry fields you need as on survey, as you did earlier on paper sheets, of course. But you can integrate the photos and all the topographic information directly. We're counting the pottery directly on the field and keeping then just the diagnostic features. Otherwise, even with such quite small scale survey, this is still a huge amount of material. And we're documenting then pottery. You can actually use the same system to do it, and also photographing everything then at Colonna Museum at Aegina. And the same for the lithics. There is actually quite a large amount of lithics collected at many sites, but also scatters around many tracts, which is quite surprising if you think about the quite low visibility in this kind of landscape. In fact, about 91% of tracts have actually pottery, which is much more than we would ever have expected. So we counted more than 12,000 shirts, of which we kept about a sixth, and more than 300 lithics and tiles from these different structures, which I think is a quite impressive result for such a landscape where you would not expect that much. And this is certainly something that we'll be working more on in the months and years to come, is then to understand also different scatters of finds in the landscape. So we focused mainly on the part north, west, and east of Oros, while the F8 and especially Sofia Michalopoulou has done a lot of work already in preparation of potential public works, so rescue documentation in the southern part of Aegina that will be published by her in Archaeology on Teltion, and that is of course an important and integral part of this area. So the earliest site we have documented so far, and this is a discovery from this spring, is on this rocky outcrop, always with you towards Hellanion Oros, a site that has produced quite a good amount of final Neolithic to early Bronze, beginning of the early Bronze Age material, a very typical location, of course, for that period, for different regions, especially on islands, which also produced all those lithics actually that I have shown before. And a site that is in a very good position. It is close to a quarry for andesite, the material used for millstones, one of the export products actually from Aegina. A site, of course, these are not finally Neolithic or early Bronze Age, but it is an area that is on a very wide surface. You get actually these almost finished or half finished millstones, probably from the early modern period, but there is a lot of material, both lithics, but also pottery from a whole range of periods, including antiquity, that clearly show that this site was already exploited earlier. So that's a view from this early Bronze or final lithic site towards this ridge on which there are many structures of quite late periods of the medieval period, and then at here in this area we have the quarries. And at the same time, we have here a small inland plateau, Elionas, with an olive grove, with olive trees that are also several hundred years old. Of course, a perfect area also for exploitation. It's still used for grazing animals today, but that could be used also for agriculture, and it's a protected area that has actually no view towards the sea. And it's an area in which we have found during intensive survey at many locations lithics, and that I think they cannot be explained all just by slope deposits from the sites higher up on the ridges or on these outcrops. Another site that has been discovered this year is just here near to the village of Vlachides, the only still inhabited or slightly inhabited, almost inhabited village, and just between Oros and the Megali Koryfi, the other Mycenaean site. Here on these terraces just below the village, so a nice area that also can be used and was used until recently. There's even still partially used for agriculture. And in the back you see Megali Koryfi, so the fortified sites. Or here the view from Megali Koryfi with a Cyclopean fortification wall, and then towards here Vlachides, the village with a site, and then Oros in the background. A site that was used diachronically, but certainly starts already in the Mycenaean period. You can see some painted Mycenaean material here from the surface, or the typical tripod legs that clearly show that this site starts in the latest in the Mycenaean period. And we think that this is one of the This is certainly a significant change, because that actually shows that these two mountaintop sites are not isolated in the landscape. Of course, you have a bit further north is also Lazarides, and all these together actually makes up an entire settlement landscape, if you want, and puts all these mountaintop sites also into a major framework. And certainly we need more exploration of other areas around to see if there are more sites that actually would fit into a wider picture of Aegina, indeed being much more exploited in the inland in the Mycenaean time and towards the end of it. Now, there are not many finds so far that we could assign to the historic period, especially archaic period, but maybe, I mean, now we're in a phase that settlement was concentrated to the Colonna and the surrounding campos. But there are scatters at several places of pottery from classical or Hellenistic time, and most of it probably belongs actually to the period after the Athenian conquest of Aegina, and that's what Irina Polinskaya has documented in detail with all these Oros inscriptions in the landscape, especially south of the Oros, around the village of Sfenduri. We also were able to redocument some of those, so that are delimiting areas that were used then maybe by Athenian clerics after the conquest of Aegina and the expulsion of the Aeginitan population, which makes of course a huge difference to the landscape use in that period. But the sanctuary definitely was still being used until the Roman period on the peak. It's also a period when the area was used or was fortified for its strategic location, which is not that surprising, with a circular tower at the southern tip of Aegina, an area that was refortified again in the 20th century, where you can see different bunkers here in this area, just very close by, of course, attesting to the strategic location of the southern tip of Aegina for the wider Saronic Gulf. And in general, it's an area where you can document not only this andesite quarrying, but it's also an area where you have other stones. It's, after all, it's a volcanic area, right? And I think it's more than obvious if you see all the structure of the landscape and the Oros itself. There are many traces of quarrying in the landscape from different periods. And then after antiquity, when the sanctuary was closed, then we have again this settlement as mentioned before, and this is also the period now in the medieval period that we get all these different structures in the landscape, and it is very intensively used up to the early modern period. And it is used until today as a ritual site, as said before, and an analepsy or ascension are being celebrated on top of the mountain every year, which is an impressive celebration, of course, at this location. And of course, if you think with fire, which is maybe not very responsible after all, but of course, if you think about the visibility of the site, and I guess you can really see it also from all these other locations that you were able to see it in antiquity, you would also see it today during such celebrations. And then in the morning with a church service, and then for ascension in the small church on the mountaintop. So actually, the landscape today is again a richer landscape, as it was during all the periods of heyday of Aegina, and maybe we can call it today also a heyday for Aegina, with all its development, if you want. And you can see here on the map also all these different churches, mainly on different tops, mountain tops and smaller peaks, that really make up all this area as a richer landscape today again. And we hope, of course, that it will not shift again to a place we need for refuge in another period. So here, just one more picture. You can see one of these peak churches that really make up an interconnected network of small churches of different dedications around this landscape today. Now, if you want to read more about the project and these different results, you can see them on the website of the Swiss School, isaac.swiss, where you can download our annual reports, and we have them here for everyone. But you can also find our annual reports in Antike Kunst, which is also online available on the website. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for this interesting talk. I was told that we should turn on the microphone, at least for our listeners that will be listening to us, hopefully, and then later on when everything is published on the site of the Belgian School. Thank you once more for this very intriguing talk. I think you've given us many insights into a very well-known site, new insights to that, but also then expanding onto that into more intensive and extensive regional research within this fascinating area. So I'm sure there are very interested comments, questions we posted. I can already see at least a half-raised hand.
Yeah, I would just mention that the entire team is actually here, so there's definitely someone to answer.
Great, thank you very much for this the fascinating presentation. It's nice to see the overview of sort of changing settlement patterns in a region of an island that played such an important role in the history of the Aegean up to modern times. I wanted to ask, because from what you've presented, that emerges kind of a picture kind of similar to what we see in other parts of the on other islands, sort of potentially colonized sort of the sanctuary, then replaced by refuge settlement. Then we have a later sanctuary, and in terms of economic activities, some animal pens, flour mills, and so on. I want to ask, is there anything that emerges as kind of unique to Aegina from or to that part of Aegina from the research that you've done that makes the islands kind of stand out, or is it kind of flowing with the rest of the region in terms of shifts in settlement pattern and the types of economic activities taking place in the islands? Thank you.
It is part, really, of course, piece of a larger picture, and I think also that's why Aegina is interesting, why it's interesting to document one of these sites. It is also until very recently that these type of sites have not been explored in the detail that they should be, or that they're worth to be. But of course, it's also linked to the very specific history or developments of Aegina itself. And I mean, Aegina has this very distinct story to tell with the harbor site in the Bronze Age. And then, of course, with all their, as an archaic naval power, then the destruction by the Athenians. And then again, I mean, as it takes on again in the early modern period. I think it's both, but it's also definitely linked also to a very specific Aeginetan story. And it's also linked to this place as such, I mean, with its visibility and its very dominant position. But it certainly is also something that will emerge. The more of these kind of sites you would explore, I think you would find, of course, much more such information. I mean, and if you see what François de Polignac is doing with the sanctuaries of Zeus, and he's doing that not only around the Saronic Gulf, but more largely, widely in Peloponnese. When you start to explore these sites, you actually see that more of them than we knew until recently were used already in the Bronze Age, or even before, and that they're also used as sanctuaries in more recent times. But many of these are also hard to explore. I mean, the Athenian ones, today they're overbuilt, both in Hymettos and Parnitha, so it's very hard to work there. In Kytheron, I mean, the ancient structure has never been found in Boeotia, but it's also overbuilt by military structures today. So Aegina is certainly also a good location for that, although we have the small church, of course, but still the site is accessible and can be documented. Yeah.
Well, just to add a bit, what is unique, after all, is Oros itself, by which I mean that this long use over almost, not necessarily continuous, but over the larger part of the last 4 millennia, this is not usual at all, to my knowledge at least. That is to say, refuge settlements or defensible settlements. They do exist throughout the Aegean, mostly in specific periods, say the final Neolithic or in part of the Bronze Age, then again the last part of the Bronze Age, and then back in the so-called Byzantine Dark Ages. What is not usual is to have a repeated use at the same site. over these periods, and to have this change from refuge in brackets, of course, habitation and dwelling in defensible place, and then back to sanctuary and so on and so forth. This is not usual. More often than not, these are strictly habitation sites, not ritual sites.
Any further questions? Questions? Well, I may then, while the others are still thinking about further questions, perhaps. You were mentioning just now in the following up questions for François de Polinac's raising of the intervisibility, and of course, when seeing your slides, it becomes it's very convincing to say specifically in good weather, but then one could talk about seasonality, etc., etc. I would just to pose one question. I mean, the intervisibility is one thing, but following that, one would have to ask the question of contemporaneity, and also if one would want to suggest a real link in what kind soever, one would have to probably substantiate that with more material evidence. So I was wondering, based on your more recent excavations, and one has to underline the exceptionality of the finds. Have your ceramic analysis shown any forms of import, export, something like that that adds to our current image?
I think we're not yet there, for at least for the historic periods. It's also part of the site. It's hard to excavate after all. It could be done, but I mean, for the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age is a typical Aeginethan site. It's Aeginethan material, but that's not surprising. For the historic periods, we don't have the assemblages that we could do such study for the moment. No. But I mean, he's based out on other things like calendars and other, dates of celebrations and the introduction of different cults. So there is much more out of historic sources that you can use. And I mean, several of these sanctuaries, we are based only on historic sources, as for example, Kithaeron that I mentioned before. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm really impressed by the work that you've done over the last years. My question is, I have two questions. One refers to the relations with Salamis, because there we see a similar pattern moving from the curves towards the peaks inside the island, and even some patterns like the circular tower on the south, the top of the tip of the island is, I don't know, it looks very similar to as a geographic point. But my question for your area would be, do you have any traces of tombs in that area at all, of any period?
As always, in the center.
Well, we got one grave with two individuals this year, but it's from the Mycenaean period, and it's under the building we excavated. In a cavity in the rock, there is an adult and a child, just on the floor. Well, otherwise, we have no tombs at all.
Thank you.
Well.
Further questions, comments? While I walk through the islands.
But I mean, in this respect, where you have to integrate then Lazarides into the discussion, and of course, there is both settlement and cemetery.
We also have the excavator here. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking that, and especially if you start to compare us with Kanaki, with the different sites and Salamis, of course, Lazarides is part of the answer, or maybe the answer.
Thank you very much. Just thinking about the expanding from your survey area to the island and comparative analyses. With the material you're getting on the mountain and the contemporary sites elsewhere on the island at both the Temple of Faya and Colonna, do you see also not only like similar ceramic wares, but also similar assemblages, or are you getting different assemblages of material indicating maybe different use of the, well, of course there's different use of the site because of the geography, but is that reflected in the material you're excavating as well?
Well, Well, it's hard to answer that. I mean, the documentations are very different at Afaya and on the Oros. On Afaya, of course, we have also a lot of, actually much more ritual material from the Bronze Age, which is still very rare on the Oros. We have this one figurine that was found in the early excavations, and there are few fragments only of Mycenaean figurines so far. Then we have, of course, the late Helladic 3C assemblage, which is important for Aegina in general because there are not many of these complete assemblages, or not at all. But we're not yet here to compare fabrics and this kind in that detail. Certainly not. And I mean, okay, Afaya is an all different story then, after all. I mean, with all the material evidence from the historic phases.
You have mentioned contribution from the geometric to the Roman period.
Yeah.
Do you have architectural remains?
Architectural structures, the historic periods.
Well, on the mountain top, there is this basement which is under the church, and the church is built with architectural blocks that have certainly not been carried up to the mountain because there's more than enough stone materials. They're from the mountain top, but you cannot really excavate because the church is now on what is left from foundations. But there are these two marble fragments that unfortunately are lost today that show that there was some built architecture, or kind of an altar. Yeah.
The altar piece.
Yeah. There's not. We didn't find anything in marble, for example. But there are fragments of big Corinthian tiles, for example. So there was some roofed structure as well. But I mean, this is really where the church is today. So.
Is it what you have shown in great squares?
Yeah. But there is pottery from geometric to Roman time. There are many Roman lamps, which is an interesting find as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what we basically excavate now the last years is a layer that covers the slope just north of the church, which is on top of the Mycenaean layers. So it's actually what they have thrown down, what has been thrown down. But it's interesting because all the small animal bones, the burnt animal bones from the sacrifice that took place on the site. But architectural remains is probably impossible to document on the very peak.
Any final questions, comments? Well, if I may end with one last question. You were mentioning very briefly, because I'm sure there are some in the audience who might be interested in more methodological questions as well. You were mentioning very briefly that you were conducting or aim to conduct more remote sensing methodology. Is there anything in the works in terms of, I don't know, LiDAR, drone-based LiDAR, airborne LiDAR, satellite imagery? Because you're also mentioning, of course, we're talking about the visibility or the difficulty of really seeing fine elements, but very surprising at the quantity that you were able to collect. Are there any plans or something?
We worked a lot for the documentation with the satellite imagery, of course, and you can see many of the structures, but of course you have to do ground tests as well. But it's definitely an area with all this vegetational cover, although low, but that would be very good for LiDAR. Yeah, it's something that we should think about in the near future.
Since, well, this was cool.
Yeah. I mean, that would certainly help a lot for the documentation of the.
And that's what would be very interesting for me, at least, is to correlate potential structural evidence with the material lines that you are collecting in the field in the survey units.
Well, just a comment on this. The larger part of our area is very much inclined to terrace as well. And so the distance between the individual terraces are not that big after all, which means that I guess that LiDAR would not be of much use, meaning that if there are ancient walls which are preserved in situ and have not been demolished for a terrace to be built, then the foundation will serve as base for the posterior terraces.
So you only see the there.
Yes.
Any further questions? If that's not the case, And we thank you once more for this very intriguing, very interesting talk.